You know how I'm always talking about breaking rules? Well, this is one rule that can't be broken. This is just a reality of our own brain. We perceive something that's louder as better. So, as a mix engineer, you have to understand that, or your mixes will never work. Well, am I ever excited for today's session? Last week was all about volume dynamics and how I like to pre-emphasize my mix before I hit the limiter. Well, for this week's session, I thought it'd be a natural follow-up to share exactly what I get up to on my master bus and why. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my own personal mix chain that I get up to here at hiwattlabs, but it's so important to understand that this isn't the way to do it. This is just the way I do it, and I get some killer results from it. So I'm gonna share it. What I encourage you to do is sort of look at the session more globally. You know, maybe there's some idea or part of my process that you could incorporate into yours and get better results. Well, just for perspective, let's have a listen to a few bars of the little ditty that I've got up for today's session. Check it. Yeah, very simple work in progress there, but perfect for today's session. You know, inside of Pro Tools, and you'll have to relate this to whatever DAW or system that you choose to work in, I've got a master fader available to me. That master fader is the last visual and volume control that I have for the main output of my DAW. Now, what's interesting about the master fader inside of my sessions is that I'm not using it to host plugins. That master fader is doing nothing but providing a visual representation for me of what the final level is that's coming out of my DAW. So when I set up a new mix inside of Pro Tools, I create a brand new kind of intermediate mix bus on the way to that main output. I do that by simply creating a stereo auxiliary. I assign the input to a familiar bus that I have available to me. For me, it's always 31 and 32. Of course, you can choose any available bus. It doesn't have to be 31 and 32. That's just left over and kind of ported over from the old SSL days. I spent a lot of years mixing on an SSL, and each one of their channel strips has 32 groups on it. So I would often use those groups to set up submixes, basically. And 31 and 32 is a common one. So if I go to this session and just simply expand this track, you can see that I've got the input assigned to bus 31 and 32. This first auxiliary, this main kind of mix bus, this is exactly where I like to introduce a compressor. Just something to help me contain my mix a little bit before I send it out for my analog process. What compressor am I using for that? Well, that varies. It depends on what track I'm working on, but I could promise you probably 75% of all the tracks that I mix end up getting a Universal Audio Shadow Hills mastering compressor plugin. I love this compressor. The fact that it seemingly just makes everything sound better. And this is where we have to be so careful as producer engineers. Why? Because it doesn't matter how much experience we have, whether we are a consumer out there buying a record and putting it on our record player, or whether we're a professional that's been at the console for 30 plus years. One thing remains true for a human being, and that is if we hear the identical sound, but one of those sounds is like half a dB louder than the other, our brain perceives that sound as being better. Not louder, better. Yeah, that's just a concept and reality that as a mix engineer, we have to be well aware of. That idea that louder is better, or at least that's the way our brain perceives it. And we have to be hyper aware of that when we sit down and do a mix. You know, my goal normally is to sort of just contain the mix a little bit. Today, I'm absolutely going for it, and I'm giving that mix some serious character with this compressor. Check it. So clearly I'm adding a substantial amount of compression to this, and it's awesome. It's adding character and attitude to all these parts. Well, I remember arranging this little ditty on my laptop and under headphones out on the deck. Not unusual when I don't have any serious engineering in hand. When I'm just trying to put an arrangement together, I'll often just look for a brand new headspace. Of course, I've got a collection of plugins available to me on my system on my laptop. Those plugins are not nearly as extensive as what's available to me on my main system, but one thing that will often happen is while I'm putting an arrangement together, I'll just choose some plugin and put it on the whole mix or some segment of that mix. This is a great example where I'm using Soundtoy's Radiator on the whole mix and adding some heat to it, but also getting rid of a bunch of muddy bottom. And I have no idea why I chose this plugin that particular day, but in my own experience, often when I do that kind of thing and I port it back into my main rig, I just roll with it because it ends up sounding perfect, exactly what I was after. And that's the case of this Radiator. Let's have a listen to it in place and then I'll bypass it. Listen to how much more mud and stuff is coming through the mix. Check it. Yeah, this is a great example where it's sort of designed as a temporary plugin, but when I port the session into my main room and listen to it, it's like, roll with it, sounds killer. So you can see that my main auxiliary bus or mix bus is assigned to analog out 5 and 6 of my Apollo. Well, that is patched directly into the line inputs of my 7600s, my API channel strips. Well, let's have a listen to what these APIs are bringing to the track. And there's some kind of magic that comes from these APIs and the fact that they add so much more separation to my mix. Now, I have a theory as to why I believe this particular pair of APIs are adding so much width and depth to my mixes. I believe it has everything to do with the fact that they were manufactured 10 years apart. So they are not matched in any way, shape, or form. They just get wide. So boom, now I've got my main output hitting my analog chain. Once that process happens, I simply create another stereo auxiliary bus immediately below the first one that I set up so that I can capture the analog signal coming back from those APIs. And you can see that the input is assigned to line 1 and 2 of my Apollo, which is normal to the output of my APIs. I don't even have to patch anything there. I just pick up the signal on line 1 and 2. And this stereo auxiliary is exactly where I like to insert my limiter, after the whole analog chain and as I'm digitizing that signal. Now, we're not talking about heavy limiting here at all. 1, maybe 2 dB at the most. But that minor amount of limiting at this stage, this will help bring your mix together in such a good way. You know, whether I'm sending a project out to be professionally mastered or not, doesn't matter. I'm still inserting a limiter every single time I'm doing a digital mix. But like I say, I'm not crushing that limiter. I'm going real easy on it. Have a look. So you see what I'm talking about? I'm not crushing that mix. I'm not trying to gain from that limiter what a mastering engineer would. I'm just trying to bring my mix in a little bit. And this will do wonders to your mix, I promise you. Well, just for the exercise, I'm gonna go ahead and assign my main bus, the one that I've got feeding my analog chain. I'm just gonna go ahead and assign it right to the master fader of Pro Tools. So we bypass that whole analog chain and this limiter. Let's have a listen to this. It's amazing the difference. Now, I'll quickly assign that right back to 5 and 6 so it goes through the analog chain. Check this. You can see clearly that I'm not being very aggressive with this limiter, but that 1 or 1.5 dB of limiting, that'll bring your mix together in such a good way, and it'll help it translate to the outside world. There's still tons of dynamic range and lots of transients for that mastering engineer to work with. Yeah, regardless of whether my production is going out for a professional mastering job or not. There's a limiter in place every single mix that I do. And then to capture my final mix or record it, I simply lay it back onto a stereo audio track within that same session. Well, thank you very much for sitting in on today's session, and I hope some of these ideas inspire you to create your own master bus, your own custom mix chain. I don't believe that there's a better investment of your time in the studio. Listen to what happens to your mixes.